The last few examples, we're going to look at processing CSV files and web pages. Okay, so as you probably know, CSV files are a text-based form of a spreadsheet. CSV stands for comma separated values, and it's just a text file, but there's commas separating all the bits of data. So we can easily read and process these because they're like text files, so we can look up a value or add up a column of figures or insert new data. What we're going to do in this example is just add up columns of figures from a CSV file. So the CSV file in the download is just this one. Just got three columns actually, 11 rows and 3 columns, and the 3 columns are just the values and then some squares of those values and cubes of those values, just some data. Okay, so how do we deal with that? Well, we can read that in, and then we can find out how many columns there are by splitting that first row where it finds a comma. Okay, this is basically what we do to deal with a CSV file. Everywhere there's a comma, we split each row where there's a comma, and that gives us a list of possibly, in this case, the number of the header, the fields, or we can split each column to get cells. Then we ask the user, we loop over we loop endlessly until the user wants to finish when they enter a -1, and we ask them which column they want to add up. And if they enter -1, then we break out of this loop. So to add up the sum of that column, we just set a total to 0, and we loop over the rows in the contents. So the contents, remember, contains a list of rows. But we start from 1 because we assume that the first row is the headers. So looping over those rows, we can take each row and split it into its cells. So this row variable here is the cells because we split the row by commas. And then the ones that we're trying to add in are the particular cell we're interested in is using the column index that the user's given us of that row. And then we turn that into a number and add that into the total. So if I run that, remember the first row contained just values, so if I hit 0, then I get 55, which is 1 plus 2 plus 3 up to 10. I hit 1, I get the sum of all the squares up to 10. And if I hit 2, I'll get the cube, sum of all the cubes. If I hit 3, what happens? I get an error. I get a traceback. So that would be an ideal place to put in a try and accept loop to give the user some useful feedback if they give us a number that isn't one that we're expecting. Okay, that's dealing with a CSV file. I don't want to spend too long on that, but you can imagine you could write a program that would process CSV files and update them. We can also look at web pages. It's very easy to read web pages from within a Python program because a web page is basically just a text file. It lives on a server, and normally we don't look at it as a text file. We read it into a web browser. The web browser goes to the server, asks for the file, and displays it. But actually, it is generally just a text file. It might have some images in it, but they come in separate files. And typically, HTML, the contents of a web page is HTML code, which is full of markup, things like CSS and JavaScript code. So it's not so easy to read as a text file, but it's still just text. It is possible to use external libraries to extract the content. So you can actually get the content out of the page, ignoring the markup, the HTML markup, but we're not going to do that today. Instead, we just read and print out the web page. The user chooses which one. So we ask them which page they want, and then this bit of code, we ask them for a page, strip any blank spaces off it, and create this file, and then read it and decode it and print it out. Let me show you that working. I'm not going to ask the user for a file. I'm going to ask myself for a file. I'm going to comment that out. I'm just going to use the University of Greenwich homepage and read that out. So the URL is this one, University homepage. And if I run that, it will go to the web, ask the server for the contents of that page, and print it all out. And there it all is. Okay, it's a whole load of contents there for the University of Greenwich homepage. There you can see it again. And you can do some processing of that. So this is another example of just opening the same page, but this time we're going to count all the letters and do a frequency count of all the letters. Okay, just like we did at the end of last week's lecture, we can count the frequency of letters. So what do? It's exactly the same bit of code in the middle here that reads in the file and stores it in the content, which is a single string. But then we can use this function letter frequency to count the contents. Okay, that's this function here, which basically starts it sets this count to 26 empty spaces, and then for every character in this string, that's the string being the whole contents of the web page, if it's an alphabetic character, so if it's A to Z, it will add it to that particular value, add 1 to that particular value, and return these counts. Okay, so when I run it there, you can see that A appears 1848 times, and so on. Okay, just some notes about that. I mean, I don't want to spend too long about that on the processing of this. This is just to show you that you can use use Python to open a file and process it using some of the ideas that we looked at in the string processing last week. The letter frequency is a bit different to the frequency function we looked at last week. It's maybe a bit simpler. It doesn't use a dictionary, although there's an example in the download that does use a dictionary, and it just creates a list of 26 items, 1 for each letter, and it initializes each to 0, and then as it processes the page, it uses out what the index of each letter is using the ORD function. So that's basically A has the index 0, B has an index 1, and so on. So it will be able to take each of those letters, A, convert it into an index 0, and then add it into the total frequencies. As I say, I don't really want to get into the processing too much. It's just to show you that you can take a web page and do some processing on it. Okay, so today we've looked at how to access files. We've seen how to open and read them. We've seen a spell checker. We can list files, count the length of the files, search through files. There's lots of things you can do now that you can access files in the file directory. We've looked at the create, read, and update, and delete functionality. Mostly we focus on reading, but it's perfectly possible to update and delete files. And we've seen that we can apply this to CSV files and web pages as well. There's also a couple of very important concepts in the lecture. I haven't spent much time on them, but just so that you're aware of what they are. One is exception handling, which we've seen a couple of times, which is where we can, if anything goes wrong while we're running the program, we can catch that in our except block and give the user a useful, friendly error message. And we've also seen recursion being when a function calls itself and drills down into it, maybe into some data or into, in this case, in the file system, to give us a very simple way of processing quite complicated, quite complicated structure by recursing into that structure. Okay, hope you found that interesting. I'm going to finish the lecture here.